So your work on evolution has a lot of implications for medicine, and I'm curious about your opinions about whether this is something doctors need to learn or if it's really not very relevant for them.
Well, I clearly think they need to know more about evolution, and it ought to start in high school, if not before, go right through undergraduate education and right into medical school.
What are some of the principles of evolutionary biology you think are important for doctors to understand?
One of the main things I think they need to understand is the evolution of drug resistance. We have a tremendous problem in
So
this
antibiotic
country.
resistance and cancer chemotherapy mainly?
Yeah, all of those things. HIV drug resistance. For years and years and years, we had individual drugs that we would treat cancers with or HIV infections with, and they would work for a while and then they would stop.
So I remember when I was a resident, we were treating kids with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And the doctors in charge said, we've got to use only one drug so we can save other drugs in case the one fails. And I think thousands of kids died because we weren't using evolutionary thinking.
That's right, and thousands of adults died of AIDS because we thought the same thing with the early treatments.
So why does triple drug therapy work better for both cancer chemotherapy and for HIV?
Well, if you have an appreciation of evolution, you realize that mutations that cause resistance to single drugs are rare. On the other hand, there are millions and millions of bacteria or viruses in your body or cancer cells.
So those mutations are going to happen.
Those mutations are going to happen, but what you do if you use a combination of drugs is you require 2 or 3 mutations all to be in the same cell. So that if the chances is 1 of a million of having those in a single cell, the chances of having 2 mutations that protect against 2 drugs, is 1 in a million times 1 in a million, which is a very
Much
big
better
number.
odds.
And if you add a 3rd drug, then you have a million times a million times a million.
So what are the implications for our progress in treating HIV?
Well, I mean, eventually we figured it out. What we figured out was that these drug combinations were very, very important. And now, because we know about that, we can treat HIV almost as a simple chronic disease. But unfortunately, it took a decade or more before people really came to that realization. I think of all of our physicians that had a sound evolutionary background, they would have discovered this considerably earlier.
So that's one big implication. Are there other principles doctors really should understand about evolutionary biology?
Well, I think that's the big one, because one of the things that we know now is that drug-resistant bacteria are killing more people than handguns in the U.S.
And
today.
that's a lot.
That is a lot. And so ignorance and denial of evolution are really what's behind that, because we know how to combat these problems in hospitals and our clinics, but it takes a concerted effort by all of the doctors, by the hospital administrators, and even the administrators of different hospitals in the same city. And the fact that we don't have that education, I think, is really hurting us medically right now, because it's become more and more and more dangerous to go into a hospital, because if you get one of these infections and there are no drugs to treat it, it's just like we've gone back to 1930 when there were no drugs to treat infections.
So you've also thought a lot about defenses shaped by natural selection, that is, specialized things that go off when they're needed. Is that something doctors need to understand?
Yeah, I think that doctors shouldn't necessarily think about treating every symptom of every sickness without giving it careful consideration. It may be that that symptom is an effective defense against the sickness, and before
so
we
what's an example of that?
An example might be a fever that would help combat an infection. And what's the alternative to that? Well, you treat it with an antibiotic, and you are now down the road to antibiotic resistance. So I just think that...
So one of my friends called me from a hospital bed where his doctors were trying to give him something to reduce his fever, and he told his doctors, evolution says you shouldn't treat a fever. What's your opinion about that jumping to conclusion?
Well, as somebody who almost died of a fever from malaria, I'd have to say that you have to keep these things within sensible ranges. So you can easily get a fever that's life-threatening, and clearly you need to treat that fever. But a normal fever that we might just automatically reach for the bottle of aspirin, that might be something that we should rethink.
So is fever just a cranking up of your metabolic system, or is it a regulated kind of thing?
Well, we think that increasing your body temperature a few degrees is probably detrimental to the bacteria that have infected your body, and that it may actually be beneficial response, and that you might be better off just waiting to see if your body can defeat that.
Right. So in your position at University of Alabama, you're trying to make connections with the medical school with some of these ideas, but it's hard. Is that right?
It is hard. I spend a lot of time doing it. I was very gratified when I first got there. One of the physicians called me out and wanted to go to lunch with me, and at lunch he handed me one of his recently published papers, and that paper had antagonistic pleiotropy in the title.
Great.
I thought, this is fantastic.
Right. But that was one doctor, it sounds
That
like.
was one doctor. That was one doctor.
Right.
Yes, but now I think, particularly in the infectious disease field, we're trying to establish links between the people that work on aging and the people that work on infectious diseases. Mm-hmm. And I think because so many of us in aging are cognizant of these evolutionary ideas, that we might be able to infect the infectious disease.
I see. So would you say it's fair to say that the aging research community has been transformed, to some degree at least, by evolutionary thinking?
Absolutely. When I first got into the field, you never heard at an aging conference the word evolution, and certainly not the word antagonistic pleiotropy. But today...
So what is antagonistic pleiotropy?
Antagonistic pleiotropy is this idea that aging is at least partially caused by genes that have beneficial effects early in life, but detrimental effects later on. Now we know so many of these genes. I never go to an aging conference where I don't regularly hear the term antagonistic pleiotropy.
So if we knew all of the genes and all of their biochemical mechanisms, wouldn't that be a complete explanation for aging, or is something else needed also?
Well, I think if we knew all of the genes, but there would be a lot of them. We already know of at least 700 genes in these simple worms that are involved in aging. So all we can expect to do is to identify some of the key players, learn how to treat those key players, and hope to influence aging just a little. We're never going to cure aging.
I was kind of getting at the idea about whether evolutionary explanations and explanations of mechanisms are just pretty much the same thing, or if they're asking different questions.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, no, evolutionary theory that explains aging is explaining the logic by which natural selection cannot defeat aging.
I see.
And that's different from understanding the underlying mechanisms. I mean, we don't always have to understand the underlying mechanisms in order to make a medical advance. It helps, but before we knew how anesthesia worked, we knocked people out and prevented a great deal of pain for a long, long time.
And at first, people thought, this is unnatural, we shouldn't do it. We should keep doing surgery without anesthesia.
Right.
That was not very logical in retrospect.
No, I mean, looking from the outside, when I look at the medical community, in certain ways it's incredibly conservative. For instance, it was a long, long time after they figured out that doctors were actually causing childbed fever before it reached
what's childbed fever?
Childbed fever is a disease that women often get around childbirth. That was an infection that was actually being transmitted in maternity wards by doctors who were going from patient to patient.
Doing deliveries with dirty hands.
Without washing their hands. They may not even have washed their hands since they had done the last autopsy. Mm-hmm. And but yet it took a long time.
If I recall right, the fellow who proved that lost his job and went crazy.
I don't know about that.
Some ways, yeah. Yeah. So it's the rewards for being ahead of your time.
Right, right.
Any last comments about the importance of evolution for medicine?
I think it ought to be part of the first-year medical curriculum. And I think it could be easily integrated into courses that already exist. And it wouldn't take a lot. It really wouldn't take a lot to integrate it throughout medical school. And I just think it's a question of energy and will, something that you've shown a lot of.
So thank you for helping to make this video. This video is intended in part to exactly solve that problem. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.